I chose to focus my video on comparing two styles of jazz, bebop and illbient. It may seem like an odd comparison, but these two very different sounding styles have more in common than meets the ear. With their beginnings as radical ventures in music, their welcoming of different musicians' identities without allowing the individuality of these musicians to be lost, as well as their shared struggle in being accepted as the new sound in jazz for their respective time periods. As we learned at the beginning of the semester, bebop, as Joya points out, was a revolution that was made by sidemen, not stars. Not by Benny Goodman, but his guitarist, Charlie Christian. Not Duke Ellington, but his bassist, Jimmy Blanton. Not Earl Hines, but his saxophonist, Charlie Parker. Not Cab Calloway, but one of his trumpeters, Dizzy Gillespie. Dexter Gordon came from Louis Armstrong's band. And finally, not Coleman Hawkins, but his pianist, Thelonious Monk. This music was a deliberate decision by these players to break the formless mold of the swing era. They were concerned with content, not composition. This is exemplified in their frequent use of swing era forms and in many cases swing era compositions themselves as springboards for their need to push beyond the previous easygoing rhythms, simple riffs, and focus towards accompanying dances that dominated the swing era. Boppers wanted to push the extremes of what it meant to be an improviser, pushing the limits of range, speed, note choice not seen to that point. Bebop's entrance into the musical landscape was poorly received. In the 1948 article and interview, Bop is Nowhere, Ernest Bornemann says that bop lacks ease, a characteristic that he says is a mainstay in good art. He calls it unbeautiful, shallow, thin, and toneless. It's filled with grotesque phrasing, he says, and is under the impression that it's all deliberate. He calls the solos predictable and also leads us to believe that these players are third-raters, and that their lack of being well-regarded swing players adds to this idea that these players couldn't possibly be significant now, as if not being notable in the previous decade takes away from their merit as players. In the interview following Bornemann's assault on bebop, Louis Armstrong says the music's no good because they're playing weird chords and there's no beat to dance to. He says they're ruining the jazz scene in New York by demanding money, and he says the music they're playing doesn't warrant that kind of demand. And slowly the clubs that are featuring jazz are now more likely to feature strippers than music. All in all, Armstrong appreciates innovation, but feels that this can only be successful if the players who have gone before you are remembered as you grow as a musician. In the end, the determination of the boppers won out. Soon, bebop was a mainstay on 52nd Street, with people lining up to get a chance to hear this new radical form of jazz. A notable example of this determination is Thelonious Monk's resurgence from the obscurity he experienced throughout the 40s. It was now the early 50s. His eclectic, out-of-the-box style was what the people wanted to hear, and in no time he was recording for the Blue Note record label, and he even had a cover story on Time magazine. What about illbient? Illbient's music was a fresh take on the rhythms of genres like drum and bass and hip-hop, and the instruments associated with it, such as samplers and turntables, as tools for improvisation. So how does bebop's story compare to illbient's attempt to find its place in the music world? Many attempts to this point had been made to electrify jazz, as Robin Kelly describes in his article, Beneath the Underground, Exploring New Currents in Jazz. He says it's hard to imagine jazz at Lincoln Center, Wynton Marsalis's post, hiring a DJ. Illbient musicians, like so many before, had to find out that the genre, renowned for its freedom in improvisation, jazz, is actually a conservative art form that is not quick to accept drastic change to the status quo. Beth Coleman, a leading turntablist, requires her call on an extensive musical knowledge, she says, quick reflexes, and sensitive ear for changes in texture and mood. Exactly what the bebop musicians' goals were as they worked tirelessly to be able to call upon their vast rhythmic and tonal vocabulary at the drop of a hat. In short, a music that was not held back by musical boundaries. These boundaries included collaborations with artists from genres such as jazz, blues, and hip-hop. Just as in bebop, it was only a matter of time before we were hearing sampling and turntables more and more throughout more types of music. Graham Haynes, another master of the craft, was recording albums and being hired by other bands such as The Roots to appear on their albums. So in the end, I hope you've seen the surprising correlations between these two genres. Their births in New York City, the resistance they faced from the music community, their determined attitude to stick out their art form, and their eventual rise to the top. I think the mindsets of these two time periods are summed up by two exemplars of their genres. First, when asked about allowing non-traditional instruments like violins in jazz, Thelonious Monk just replied, "I like all instruments, played right." And when Graham Haynes declared his music jazz for the 21st century, he said, "You can't really say that jazz exists now. It can't be what it was because those days are gone. The social settings that made Coltrane's music, that made the Jazz Messengers, that made Louis Armstrong simply don't exist. We are in a different time and place. If there is a jazz, then what I'm trying to do would be it."